The most important issue is the development. Whether COP26 is of course an issue, but eventually for a developing country like us, we need to really see that the development of all the parts of the country progresses in an equitable and on a balanced manner. It is not for us to decide about what the individual basin or individual area will do as far as their management is concerned, but still how the entire integration takes place is very vital for the nation, and we need to really look at all our resources in totality, and looking at the resources in totality and also looking at the sustainability in totality, how we can progress on certain areas. And there, this relevance for the India's water security is the area that really comes to our mind, and then we will examine what is the role of Brahmaputra basin. Yeah, so if we look at the situation of India as far as the overall water availability is concerned, we have got certain major basins. And out of the major basins, as far as the geographical area of India is concerned, the two basins basically stand out. That is the Ganga basin and the Brahmaputra basin. Because if you look at these two basins, they cover more than around 60% of the area of the country, and very major development of the country lies in these regions. Since Ganga and Brahmaputra meet together in Bangladesh before joining the sea, so hydrologically we have to generally consider the Ganga and Brahmaputra as a single system, and this is the system which is largely draining the entire Himalayan range. Most of the Himalayan range in India is drained by these two basins as we look at it. These basins also have a characteristic of being international. There are transboundary issues are heavily involved here, in addition to the areas of the agriculture and industrial and other development that is happening. Now, if we look at the overall water wealth of India, then we see that we receive a total precipitation of 4,000 BCM. And out of this 4,000 BCM, what remains available for the utilization is somewhere around 1123 BCM. So which is like what you can say about 1/4 of what you really receive. And then out of this, we have about 690 BCM as the surface water, because surface water is quite crucial from the sustainability angle. Even though groundwater has been very attractive and a lot of development, or rather overdevelopment or overexploitation of groundwater has occurred because of its ubiquitousness, but the major issue is that unless you sustainably develop your surface water resources, which are capable of regenerating themselves every year on a year basis, the sustainability doesn't come, because the groundwater replenishability cycles are very, very long. Sometimes they are stretching over the geological periods, and those kind of sustainability cycles are not possible for us, who are basically tied to a hydrological and an economic year, which is much shorter than those periods. And now in the surface water area, of course, the current utilization 450 BCM, but these utilizations, like the distribution, are not uniform. There are a lot of changes in that. Now let us see how this 690 BCM that we are talking about is really occurring. If we look at the distribution across the major basins in the country, we look at the Brahmaputra at the top. That means average annual water resources potential of Brahmaputra is largest in the country, even though it may have a relatively smaller area across the country. Like it has got something like say 1,94,000 square kilometer as against the Ganga's 861,000 square kilometers. And then some of the other very major basins like Godavari, who has got something like 312 square kilometers. Even though the area is small, the water availability is much larger. On the other side, if you look at some other basins, you realize the kind of shortages or the kind of stress that the basins already have. If we look at the basin, like say for example at the bottom of the rung, you look at the Sabarmati basin, you find that the annual water resources potential is hardly 3.81 BCM. Whereas if you look at the developments, if you look at the utilization scenario, you will find that the Sabarmati basin, with the so much amount of urban development, so much amount of agricultural development, is almost consuming more than its own average annual water resources potential. And in fact, it lands up over exploiting the groundwater in an unsustainable manner. Whereas in case of Brahmaputra, if you look at it, the problem is entirely reversed. With a very little area that you actually have a huge water available in a yearly basis, and that is reflected in the problems that the Brahmaputra has vis-a-vis the other basins of the country. The problem of Brahmaputra of floods is very well known. It hardly needs any reiteration. And then the associated problems of land erosion and the other human and environmental miseries that we have to face when we look at the Brahmaputra floods. So same thing, if you look at the population also, it will be the similar kind of situation. Now just look at the groundwater situation. That the groundwater situation wise, you look at the basins which are highly water stressed in the surface component are also equally highly water stressed when it comes to the groundwater component. So the inequitability of the distribution of water across the country is a serious developmental constraint. There are various sociological and other tensions that come up primarily on account of non-availability of water. There will be, Mr. Srinivas will be able to tell all these issues much lucidly, but the issue is that the distribution of water determines a lot about the progress or about the stability of a country. Now when we come back to the Brahmaputra basin in India, we find that the Brahmaputra basin is something which has got a very, very peculiar kind of situation because its area available within the country is quite small. And out of this area that is available within the country, the plain area is relatively a very thin, narrow strip, whereas the area which is primarily a hilly area and a mountainous area is comprising of a very large kind of segment of the entire basin. Now this situation makes it a flood-prone basin when it comes to the uncontrolled flows of the basin that occur through the river valley. Simultaneously, it also makes it an ideal sites or an ideal location for generating the resources from the point of view of storages and providing for the rest of the parts of the country. So this is an opportunity and a threat. We are both having it existing very much in the Brahmaputra basin as much as it does not exist in other parts of the country. Looking at the rainfall, again we find that Brahmaputra is a very, very peculiar basin because it traverses the Great Himalayan Range and it actually goes into the Tibetan Plateau. It originates in the Tibetan Plateau and then it traverses and crosses over the Great Himalayan Ridge, and then it comes down into the rainward slopes of Himalayas, which are primarily affected by the monsoon winds. And that is why the kind of stark definition of this rainfall that you can see in this area. Whereas if you look at the boundary between the areas receiving less than 500 millimeter rainfall in a year, see, less than 500 millimeter rainfall is something almost equivalent to Rajasthan and all the other arid areas of the country. So when we say that we have got good amount of water, if you look at this boundary of this particular rainfall division, it will probably pertain almost directly to the McMahon line. There is very little difference between that line and what boundary we have. So it is very important to see that we are blessed with a lot of rainfall in our own parts of the country within which, and those parts are directly draining into the Indian territories and into the Indian landmass. So this is a very important observation. So when we look at the transboundary issues, we have to look at it with certain context. And this is a context which I find that we need to really keep in our mind. And here we can see that we have got areas which are so huge, like greater than 4,000 millimeters in a year, greater than about 1,000 to 2,000 millimeters in a year, which is the average. And they are the ones who are really contributing to both to its yield as well as to the floods, because this rainfall is largely occurring in a very short time window. That time window, generally, even in this kind of high rainfall areas also, it lasts between May, where the pre-monsoon rains start arriving around 15th of May, and then it withdraws by the end of September and beginning of October. And by about 15th of October, the monsoon ends up withdrawing even from these areas also. So in a very short window, this much amount of heavy rainfall is experienced by the basin component, which is falling very much within the Indian territory. So we discussed earlier, and now here we look at it from the other point of view, where we look at the basin-wise per capita water availability. And looking at the present population in view, we realize that even though we call Ganga a very water-rich basin and a lot of water when you look at it in the aggregate sum, but when it looks at the population point of view, you realize that Ganga is not all that great. You have got a huge population depending on that limited water resources. And when we look at this, you find the standing out of Brahmaputra and Barak. Basically, Brahmaputra-Barak is a single system, but since it is not meeting within India, so we are considering them in a separate manner. But if you just put these two together, you realize the kind of per capita availability of water. This is a huge, more than somewhere around, touching somewhere around like 14,000 cubic meter per capita per year. Whereas you have to make do with availabilities which are lesser than the water scarce index of 1,000 cubic meter per capita per year. So the importance of Brahmaputra from the water security point of view in India is enormous. Then we have, when you look at the storage capacity that we have generated out of this availability, the picture is completely reverse. If you look at the areas like say Godavari or Krishna or Narmada, the ratio of storages that we have generated versus the annual water availability is much higher than Brahmaputra, where Brahmaputra the ratio is probably the maximum highest. Like if you divide 537 by 2 versus you have got this 46 divided by 25, you can see the kind of lopsided development that we have for the storages. That means we are not storing water where it is occurring, and we are trying to store water where it is already in a short supply. But then storages are required everywhere. It is not a case that you should not store water when it is less available, but these storages who are capable of tiding over extreme shortages are the ones which have to be located in the areas which are having the highest availabilities. And this is something where we find that Brahmaputra scores largely above everybody else. We have had a lot of planning, especially from the hydropower. Mr. Paliwal will actually elucidate in a much more better way. But there's a huge amount of planning that we have already carried out and we have already envisaged, which is already there. And this is a kind of a planning which will have to be sustained through various means of financing, socio-economic and political interventions, and a focused developmental area. So as we discussed, these are the highest yield basins in the country, and we have a single source that is now available for ameliorating the stresses that the country has as far as the water resources are concerned, and who are even becoming some kind of an upper constraint on the basis of the water availability or the development. Simultaneously, the basin also has to develop, and for that, one of the biggest requirement that is ameliorating floods in the Brahmaputra floodplains, and then their water conservation strategies. We also have to recognize that these flows are occurring primarily in a highly rainfall influenced area, and some amount of flows which are coming from the less rainfall but high snowfall areas like the Tibetan Plateau are crucial in the absence of storages. Because of the absence of storages, those flows become very crucial for our lean season water availability. And there we need to really think about counter strategies so that we are able to manage those kind of issues which may happen in an adverse way as far as our neighbors are concerned. So we need to develop a holistic vision based on the hydrology and based on the overall strategic thinking. The role of Brahmaputra in energy security is again, it is of a same kind of or rather a very important part, because the development of hydropower is essential for our INDC goals. In the early period of the environmental thought, there has been a lot of negativism that got generated about the hydropower. But then if you look at the COP26 dialogues that have happened in the recent times, you realize that the COP26 communities have realized that hydropower is not all that harmful. It is a relatively benign source of energy, and a very, very eminently renewable source of energy which is capable of providing you power at the drop of a switch. So the development of hydropower is very vital for meeting our INDC goals. It's a single efficient source of peaking power, whatever other sources you may have, but the kind of grid balancing that the hydropower provides is not provided by any other source. And there, when we start looking at the other means of generating power, which are essentially a kind of a base load kind of situations, and very strongly diurnal kind of generation, like you take the case of solar power. The solar power will be available to you in something like say 8 to 10 hours window in a day, and that also the generation will be varying depending upon the season and depending upon the sunlight that is received by those plants. And this versus the requirement of peaks which are available, which are there in the early morning, which are there in the early evenings and in the night, you cannot survive without balancing act that is provided by the hydropower. So the energy security of the country, which means the energy remains available to all the consumers at every point of time and on demand, can be balanced if you have a good hydro and other power generation mixes. And for that, a single largest source of the order of 50,000 megawatt is something that cannot be ignored. And if it is ignored, it will be only at our own cost. Another important aspect is constraints of geography. We have got a situation in which our northeastern region is very loosely and very thinly connected with the mainland part. And the developmental requirements and also the strategic requirements need that we have a means of mass transportation available with the northeastern region, which is a very reliable kind of mass transportation. And there the inland water transport is the key, because as we have seen, the entire area is characterized by a thin and long and narrow valley, and this entire narrow valley is primarily having navigable depths. And when you have the navigable depths, the only issue that is required is that we have to maintain those navigable depths and provide our infrastructure. In fact, today itself, in the Hindustan Times, our Minister for Shipping and Transport, Mr. Sarvananda Sonowal, has written about the transportation of something like 200 tons of food grains, starting from Patna and then going via the Bay of Bengal and then into the Bangladesh, and then coming across and going in towards Guwahati. But this transportation can be very easily maintained all the way up to Pasighat, which is like almost you cover the entire northeastern region. And water transport is one of the main and very efficient means of transport when you have to transport it in bulk. So the inland water transport across Brahmaputra is a very crucial aspect. And then if you have to maintain a transport, you need an even kind of flows in the river. And even kind of flows will be possible, especially when you are capable of regulating the river flows in a manner which is manageable and you avoid the extreme floods, and you also avoid the extreme shortages. And there again, the management of water resources in Brahmaputra basin and our transboundary implications come forward. So these are the areas which are having a enormous impact on the entire country, because as you know, we need about 50 to 60 billion cubic meters of water in the southern India in order to manage the water stress that is happening in those parts of the country. And there a lot of social tensions are also generated out of those issues. So those issues can be only managed if we provide the extra water. And now, as you have seen in this, the only source of extra water that is available to the country at this point of time is basically Brahmaputra and nothing else. There are other issues also. Being a middle riparian country, we also have a responsibility towards the lower riparian, and for that also we need to provide them also with some kind of a security from the point of view of the water availability. And again, there the developments in Brahmaputra are the ones which can actually come to our rescue. So the basin viability and the basin importance is extremely useful and extremely necessary for us. And I feel that we need to really work very strongly and very sustainably so that we can carry out the developmental agenda of the country.